Okay, so we're going to continue here talking about Common Sense, written by Thomas Paine. As mentioned in the last episode, we have finished the main body of work, and now we are into the appendix. So I'm going to read this first paragraph as a review. I won't go over it, and then we will continue. In support of the first, that being America's separation from Great Britain, I could, if I judged it proper, produce the opinion of some of the ablest and most experienced men on this continent, and whose sentiments on that head are not yet publicly known. It is in reality a self-evident position. Foreign dependence, limited in its commerce, and cramped and fettered in its legislative powers, can ever arrive at any material eminence. America does not yet know what opulence is, and although the progress which she has made stands unparalleled in the history of other nations, it is but a childhood compared with what she should be capable of arriving at, had she, as she ought to have, the legislative powers in her own hands. England is at this time proudly coveting what would do her no good were she to accomplish it. The continent hesitating on the matter, which will be her final ruin if neglected. It is the commerce, and not the conquest of America, by which England is to be benefited, and that would in a great measure continue were the countries as independent of each other as France and Spain. Because in many articles neither can go to a better market. But it is the independence of this country, of Britain, or any other, which is now the main and only object worthy of contention, and which, like all other truths discovered by necessity, will appear clearer and stronger every day. So to continue here, firstly, because it will come to that one time or other, that is, inevitably America will separate from Great Britain. Secondly, because the longer it is delayed, the harder it will be to accomplish. I have frequently amused myself, both in public and private companies, with silently remarking the spacious errors of those who speak without reflecting. And among the many which I have heard, the following seems the most general, namely, that if this rupture should happen 40 or 50 years from now, instead of now, the continent would be more able to shake off the dependence. To which I reply that our military ability at this time arises from the experience gained in the last war, and which in 40 or 50 years' time would be totally extinct. The continent would not, by that time, have a general or even military officer left. And we, or those who may succeed us, would be as ignorant of martial matters as the ancient Indians, and this single position, closely attended to, will unanswerably prove that the present time is preferable to all others. The argument turns thus. At the conclusion of the last war, we had experience, but wanted numbers. And 40 or 50 years from now, we shall have numbers without experience. Wherefore, the proper point of time must be some particular point between the two extremes, in which a sufficiency of the former remains, and the proper increase of the latter is obtained, and that point of time is the present time. So, fairly straightforward here. There's not much to pick apart in that paragraph. When he references the ancient Indians, there's an interesting book by Benjamin Constant. He was a political thinker. I'm not exactly sure what office he held in French society, but he was active in the late 18th century, early 19th century. He lived through the French Revolution, and he wrote a book on humanity's early religious forms. And in it, he talks often about the particular way of the Indians, the sort of I don't want to call it laissez-faire, I don't want to call it laziness, but the general laid-backness, I guess, for the lack of a better term, in which the Indians had about themselves, and that sort of translated into their religious tradition. Maybe pacifistic would be a good way to describe them. But to continue here, the reader will pardon this digression, as it does not properly come under the head I first set out with, and to which I again return by the following position, namely, should affairs be patched up with Britain, and she remain the governing and sovereign power of America, which as matters are now circumstanced, is giving up the whole point entirely, we shall deprive ourselves of the very means of sinking the debt we have or may contract. The value of the backlands, which some of the provinces are clandestinely deprived of by the unjust extension of the limits of Canada, valued only at £5 sterling per 100 acres, amount to upwards of 25 millions Pennsylvania currency. And they quit rents at 1 penny sterling per acre to 2 millions yearly. So in other words, there seems to be a risk of, even if these grievances are corrected and the relationship between America and Britain is restored, there are economic considerations that can lead to a potential conflict, sort of an economic conflict. So, as it stands, America can pay off its debts. But if they are to rejoin with Britain, reunite with them, it is likely that these debts will only increase, and they will not be able to pay them off. And he cites an example of the unjust extension of Canadian territory secretly in order to, in my mind, he doesn't say this explicitly, but it would make sense that the government wants to incentivize, or the Crown wants to incentivize, Canadian settlers to settle in those regions. You reduce the price of that land so significantly that people jump at the chance to buy that land and move there, whereas the land in America is a much inflated price comparatively. So to continue, it is by the sale of those lands that the debt may be sunk without burden to any, and the quit rent reserved thereon will always lessen, and in time will wholly support the yearly expense of government. It matters not how long the debt is in paying, so that the lands, when sold, be applied to the discharge of it, and for the execution of which the Congress, for the time being, will be the continental trustees. So, let's look into that for a moment. It is by the sale of those lands that the debt may be sunk without burden to any. So in other words, if the government holds these lands and they sell it, they can decrease their debt. And the quit rents reserved thereon. So this sort of a quick rent is like a tax, a land tax. Will always lessen, and in time wholly support the yearly expense of government. It matters not how long the debt is in paying, so that the lands, when sold, be applied to the discharge of it. and for the execution of which the Congress, for the time being, will be the Continental Trustees. So this is a sticky subject, especially given our modern context with how high our national debt is. It seems as though any power it's difficult to articulate this, but the government finding itself into debt doesn't seem quite right to me, because it's the very institution of government in a free society that is responsible for protecting and securing not only the citizens of that time, but also of their posterity. And it seems as though if a government finds itself into debt, then this is inherently antagonistic to the aims of government itself. Because a debt is effectively a tax on the future. That is, we borrow money now to be paid back later. And of course, this is a difficult situation. It could be argued that the debt is justified due to the circumstances, due to the war, due to what they're fighting for. But it is not without its consequences. And the type of rhetoric here is not very savory. This is quite a bitter thing to be talking about. This is not a very liquid proposal. It's a sticky subject, especially when we're considering a nation that is liberating itself from a tyrannical one. The economic constraints, the spirit of evil, I think, nests quite easily in economic matters, in economic concerns. And so that's my reflection on this sort of thing. I suppose at some future date I will get more into the economics of these sorts of situations, but it is a sticky subject. He continues, I proceed now to the second head, namely, which is the easiest and most practicable plan, reconciliation or independence, with some occasional remarks. He who takes nature for his guide is not easily beaten out of his argument, and on that ground I answer generally that independence, being a single, simple line, contained within ourselves, and reconciliation, a matter exceedingly perplexed and complicated, and in which a treacherous, capricious court is to interfere, gives the answer without a doubt. So I'm not quite certain what he means by he who takes nature for his guide. When I hear that, first and foremost, I think pantheism, but it doesn't seem to imply that. But he says, independence being a single simple line, that it is contained within ourselves. And if we were to go the other route, the route of reconciliation, we'd leave this matter, this complicated matter, not to ourselves, but to some body that is prone to variability, instability, the changing of mind, the changing of heart. And within this instability, it leaves us with a simple answer to that question. It is independence. The present state of America is truly alarming to every man who is capable of reflection. Without law, without government, without any other motive power than what is founded on and granted by courtesy, held together by an unexampled concurrence of sentiment, which is nevertheless subject to change, and which every secret enemy is endeavoring to dissolve. Our present condition is legislation without law, wisdom without a plan, a constitution without a name, and, what is strangely astonishing, perfect independence contending for dependence. The instance is without a precedence. The case never existed before, and who can tell what may be the event? The property of no man is secure in the present unbraced system of things. The mind of the multitude is left at random, and seeing no fixed object before them, they pursue such a fancy or opinion presents. Nothing is criminal. There is no such thing as treason. Wherefore, everyone thinks himself at liberty to act as he pleases. The Tories dare not have assembled offensively. Had they known that their lives, by the act, were forfeited to the laws of the state, a line of distinction should be drawn between English soldiers taken in battle and the inhabitants of America taken in arms. The first are prisoners, but the latter are traitors. The one forfeits his liberty, the other his head. So an interesting paragraph here. He describes the current state of America, the one without law, without government, without any other mode of power than what is founded on and granted by courtesy. It's held together by an unexampled concurrence of sentiment. It's subject to change, and every secret enemy is attempting to dissolve it. And our condition is legislation without law. An interesting thing, legislation without law. Almost oxymoronic. Wisdom without a plan, another oxymoronic statement. A constitution without a name, and, what is strangely astonishing, perfect independence contending for dependence. So, America, in some sense, has the infrastructure. They're this loose body that is held together by these relatively strong forces, in my opinion at least. I mean, it doesn't really have the government, it doesn't have the law, but it has the sentiment, it has the courtesy, and it has the values that are shared, which are the prerequisite to any union. So this instance is without precedent. It has never existed before. The property of no man is secure in the present unbraced system of things. So the mind of the multitude is left random. See no fixed objects before them, they can pursue anything. Nothing is criminal. He says the Tories dare not have assembled defensively, had they known that their lives by that act were forfeited to the laws of the state. A line of distinction should be drawn between English soldiers taken in battle and inhabitants of America taken in arms. The first are prisoners, that is, the English soldiers that are taken by the Americans, but the latter are traitors. The one forfeits his liberty and the other his head. So you can see the sort of dichotomy here between the English experience and the American. Obviously, the American is much more open, liberal, we call it. But also we see here the implications, as is a common pattern pretty much in every sentence, every word that I read. There's this implication of a danger. The mind of the multitude left at random. And what unity can you have at random? Perhaps this calls for the necessity of government. And yet the government rules by law in a negative sense. It tells you what you cannot do, The positive law, the law of the soul and the law of the heart, is found within the community, within love, let's say. Notwithstanding our wisdom, there is a visible feebleness in some of our proceedings which gives encouragement to dissensions. The continental belt is too loosely buckled, and if something is not done in time, it will be too late to do anything, and we shall fall into a state in which neither reconciliation nor independence will be practicable. The king and his worthless adherents are got at their old game of dividing the continent, and there are not wanting among us printers who will be busy in spreading specious falsehoods. The artful and hypocritical letter, which appeared a few months ago in 2 of the New York papers, and likewise in others, is an evidence that there are men who want either judgment or honesty. So a picture begins to emerge here of a United States that is being subjected to propaganda by the English state, and it is quite clear that in their present state, without a governing institution that has law, that has government. I mean, they have the Constitution and they have that sentiment that we were talking about, but formally they are lacking. And it seems as though Mr. Paine is making the case that the government, the adhesive force that the government provides to society, can be, at least, viewed as a preventer of this type of disunity, sort of a boost to the cultural immune system, or the immune system of the body, not even the cultural immune system. And he says that, so the sort of propaganda that appeared in the 2 New York papers is an evidence that there are men who want either judgment or honesty. So what does this mean? A man who wants judgment wants to know if he has done right or if he's done wrong. And he has to be given that, or he has to be subjected to that by some other state or authority. And the other wants honesty. He wants the truth. And I think that the one that prefers judgment is sort of allied with more of the English way of doing things. And the one that wants honesty wants the truth and wants to be more independent. It is easy getting into holes and corners and talking of reconciliation. But do such men seriously consider how difficult the task is, and how dangerous it may prove, should the continent divide thereon? Do they take within their view all the various orders of men whose situations and circumstances, as well as their own, are to be considered therein? Do they put themselves in the place of the sufferer, whose all is already gone, and of the soldier, who has quitted all for the defense of his country? If their ill-judged moderation be suited to their own private situations only, regardless of others, the event will convince them that they are reckoning without their host. So it seems as though this split, this continental divide, on one hand susceptible to English propaganda, the other who have been acutely affected, or on the other hand understand the significance of the current circumstances and the tyranny or authoritarianism of the English over the colonists. This continental divide, Mr. Paine says, is likely due to many not understanding the severity of the situation. and their own personal circumstance, whether unaffected or benefited by English occupation, again, don't understand what they face to lose in the long run. Put us, say some, on the footing we were in the year 1763, to which I answer, the request is now in the power of Britain to comply with. Neither will she propose it, but if it were, and even should it be granted, I ask, as a reasonable question, by what means is such a corrupt and faithless court to be kept to its engagements? Another Parliament, nay, even the present, may hereafter repeal the obligation, on the pretense of its being violently obtained or unwisely granted, and in that case, where is our redress? No going to law with nations. Cannon are the barriers of crowns, and the sword, not of justice, but of war, decides the suit. To be on the footing of 1763 is not sufficient that the laws only be put in the same state, but that our circumstances likewise be put in the same state. Our burnt and destroyed towns repaired or built up, our private losses made good, our public debts contracted for defense discharged, otherwise we shall be millions worse than we were at the enviable period. Such a request, had it been complied with a year ago, would have won the heart and the soul of the continent, but now it is too late. The Rubicon is passed. So I've taken a little break between that last cut of audio and this one. I was feeling a little tired last night, so I decided to go to bed. And so today marks December 4th. It's a Sunday of 2022. And so I'd like to bury a bit of humanity in this obscure part of the internet, nearly 30 minutes into some obscure ramblings of some unknown person. What exactly is this humanity that I wish to bury? I'm not entirely sure, except for the fact that now, at this time, I continue to recognize my own existence, and at times it's rather unfortunate how drawn away I am by whether it be technology or the responsibilities of life from my acknowledgement of the very fact that I do find myself to exist in this body at this moment of time, and I exist within a broader context of a broader history, of a broader culture. I exist in a time of destabilization, of uncertainty, of confusion, and of temptation. And it's a roller coaster. I'll have to admit that it is many ups, many downs. It seems that at one time we began to discover the various psychopathologies of the individual. And certainly we've had a broad cultural tradition that is devoted to determining the psychopathologies that can plague the collective. And I recognize that I may be caught up with the collective in this time of uncertainty. But if it weren't moments like these, if it weren't for the Sundays free of the necessary labor of life to support ourselves and our goals and our pursuits, I think I would forget what's more and what's greater. I would forget the reason that I put one foot in front of the other. And I often ask myself, well, why? Why even bother one foot in front of the other every day? This monotonous sort of drone. What is the reason for it? And of course, the reason for some, I think, is more difficult than others to come to. There are some that find being and existence simple and easy. And there are others that find existence and being dreadful and difficult. And it's within the second sort that find life, again, to be a complicated matter, that reflection is of the utmost importance. Prayer is of the utmost importance. And it's not prayer to ask for things. It's not asking for material comforts or peace of mind. It's asking, what can I give so that I may receive peace of mind? A subtle difference. Because it requires sacrifice. It requires not asking of something or of someone for something. It requires the acknowledgement or the understanding of having been given everything. And it's not a matter of being given more, but rather understanding how to receive and how to accept what has already been given. And it's a painful distinction to make at times, because when we consider prayer, some perhaps, I myself perhaps, may reflect on times where I've asked for things and I have not even considered what it would take for me to receive what I'm asking for. You see, in many cases, as in the case that we've been discussing here, as Thomas Paine has been discussing in his book Common Sense, to accept something that is wanted, to accept something that has been given, something as lofty as liberty, it has conditions to its acceptance, burdens that one must bear in order for us to fully appreciate and to hold it within us. It's the funny thing about the Divine Spirit and its relationship to man is that it can be easily distorted and lost. It is a state of matter not unsimilar to the gaseous state. We know it to exist. We know it to be necessary for our life. We require oxygen to live. And yet, it's something that we go about our days, for the most part, not even perceiving that it's there. Of course, there are certain situations where we can perceive the presence of this gaseous substance by our olfactory sensation, but for the most part, we take it for granted. And I believe that the Divine Spirit is much like this. It is always with us. It is always within our ability to perceive. We are always utilizing it with our conscious minds, putting together rational thoughts, making decisions, making judgments about the right left, the one step after another, the day to day. We accept all of these things. And yet there is no shortage of taking it for granted. And at one time, perhaps, in a state of material deprivation, our motives, the questions that we ask, are quite different. They feel different because we understand acutely the importance of the body and its relationship to the mind. But in other cases, in cases of material prosperity, the mind becomes a playground, perhaps at times a battleground between opposing forces, opposing goods, let's say. Because what is evil, if but a misplaced good? Some right, left, march one foot in front of the other, south instead of north, with not quite understanding the direction in which a particular person heads. And when we consider the American Revolution and the divine spirit, as I've said in previous episodes, the spirit of liberty is a window into the goodness of the divine, of the rightness that we are given, or the perceptibility of the good that we are given. And it's not only until we find ourselves in a particular context and asking particular questions and accepting particular responsibilities that we are able to more fully appreciate what we have been given. And I wonder often, how is it possible to change such a destabilizing force that can come of a liberated collective, of a collective that inflates its ego to the point of blindness, to the point of multiplicity, multidirectionality, pursuing their own ends without asking the question, what end should I be pursuing? Why should I be pursuing them? What have I been given? And what may I receive? It seems as though we can find ourselves in this condition just as well as we can find ourselves in the condition as the early American colonists. Of course, not everybody was this way, but I'm speaking, of course, of the through line of the general spirit of liberty at the time. They found themselves in a position to again ask the right questions, to bear the right responsibilities for the particular time in history that they found themselves in. And the beauty that comes from that time, from that period, from their writings, is evident. There's often talk of self-evidence within their writings, not only in the Declaration of Independence, but others as well. And I've heard many in this modern day say that self-evidence cannot exist, or at least that all men are created equal. This sort of dialogue that's found in our Declaration of Independence is not self-evident. I believe this is only to be the case that people can deceive themselves in such a way as when the light of a former age has faded into obscurity, and the new context of the day, the new collective consciousness, the new collective pathology or multiplicity, their spirit fails. The unifying force of that spirit no longer unites them, and what is left of that collective, of that poor soul, is the institutions of the former age, and the incessant insistence on attributing all to those institutions, with the belief that those institutions will save us from our behavior and from our continual asking and our failure to accept responsibility, our failure to accept the burdens of our freedom, the failure to accept the failures of previous generations, and the failure of our responsibility to our posterity. I think this predicament that we find ourselves in, whether it be the national discord, to the outright tax on future generations through our national debt, to any number of institutions that are plagued by bureaucratic bloat and faulty representation, I can't help but to think that a mind of a previous era that was invigorated by this spirit of liberation, of liberty, would weep. Perhaps they would come to their knees in exhaustion. Perhaps they would return to the question of why, if this is to be our future, the future, why should I bother taking one foot in front of the other? And this is the unfortunate march of man. We do this throughout the ages, and we seem to carry the lessons with us in various hands, perhaps the hands that understand the importance of certain doctrine. But it fails at the collective level. And now we are at a similar point in history where what was once a uniting force, a uniting spirit, has been obscured by different spirits, by spirits of dissension, disorder, multiplicity, misplaced goods. On one hand, it's good, because within the view of this multiplicity and disunity, we will rediscover the uniting spirit. We will rediscover what it means to accept the burdens of what we ask for, if we truly choose to ask for liberation. And it is always a possibility that we can make similar mistakes as to our forefathers who tried to construct a system of governance, again, to take the power of the divine and to reduce it into the hands of man, into his institutions. The 20th century is riddled with death and violence, and it's also a story of extreme growth and massive uplifting in material prosperity. And I have to ask myself the question, how is it that two things that seem to be so antagonistic to each other can seemingly march hand in hand? It's a frightening thought to me. But anyway, this is why we read. This is why we need to understand what the spirit of liberty is. Because if we don't understand our history, if we don't understand our roots, we will be bound to make similar mistakes. Or to the time when the enemies of liberty, the antagonists of liberty, with big hearts and all the reason in the world, they seemingly have everything but the richness of soul. They will find themselves once again in a place of authority and of power. And it's not that we must return to a prior state of things. It's that we must adapt our institutions as we continue to evolve, as our technology continues to proliferate and evolve. And so we must maintain this spirit. And so with that, I would like to continue here with Common Sense by Thomas Paine. So this last paragraph that I left off with, I think has a similar sentiment to what I was just describing there. And that is to say that Thomas Paine relays sort of an anecdote. He says, some people wish that we can go back to a previous point in history. They wish we can go back to 1763 as opposed to 1775. And of course the answer is that we cannot go back to that period. It was a period of stability. But things have changed. We are seeing the world differently now. We have uncovered the reasons why this can no longer remain a stable union between the colonies and between England. And there are many, whether it be through the artificial judiciary that the Crown has imposed upon the colonists, the disregard of representation of their rights in government, the distance that separates the government of England and of that of America, the unjust taxation on the colonists, the use of their manpower in war against foreign nations or of Indian tribes, the disregard for private property in which the Americans have worked so hard for. No, we can't go back to 1763. Just like it will be the case in our future, where the answer will be no. We can't go back to the 1990s. We can't go back to the early 2000s. We can't go back to the 1950s. Things have changed. They have changed because of this. They have changed because of that. But regardless of the reason, regardless of the instability that we now find ourselves in and the desire to return to a period of stability, things have changed. And we have to accept that. No going to law with nations. Canons, the barrister of crowns? An interesting statement. On one hand, you have the canon, a device of war, and the other, the barrister of crowns, the legal authority of the crown. And he poses the question, is this weapon of war the legal authority of the crown? It's a beautiful statement, really. And the sword, not of justice, but of war, decides the suit. To be on the footing of 1763, it is not sufficient that the laws only be put in the same state, but that our circumstances, likewise, be put in the same state. Our burnt and destroyed towns repaired or built up, our private losses made good, our public debts contracted for defense discharged. And I'd like to pause here for a moment to reflect that this private debt, in some sense, although it pains me to say it, is justified due to their private defense. It is not due to some desire to maintain a certain state of growth within the economy. It is not a desire for some wanton material prosperity or the self-deception into believing that we deserve the material prosperity that we now have, that the only way that we can be happy and the way that we can survive in this modern society is with our material goods, with our technological toys. Otherwise, we shall be millions worse than we were at that enviable period. So in other words, not only have things changed, but even if we were to go back now, the very debt that we put ourselves in would make the possibility of going back different. We would have to deal with an increase in burdens, let alone everything that we have been dealing with thus far. We would be millions worse. Such a request, had it been complied with a year ago, would have won the heart and the soul of the continent. But now it's too late. The Rubicon has been passed. Caesar has come to Italy. And so, I propose the question: when will the Rubicon be crossed in our day? It's an interesting reflection. I have a feeling that it may come within my lifetime. I'm not sure what it will look like, if it will involve government. But I know eventually that this will have to happen one way or another. And on one hand, it is exciting, and on the other, frightening. But I would not want to find myself caught up in some pathological institution if it does come and when it does come. I would like my mind to be free. I would like my ability and my freedom of action to be unencumbered, unfettered by the machines that are our institutions, the giants, the Nephilim that have become our corporate bodies in the modern day America. Besides the taking up arms, merely to enforce the repeal of a pecuniary law seems as unwarrantable by the divine law and as repugnant to human feelings as the taking up of arms to enforce obedience thereto. So a beautiful statement here. Other than taking up of arms, only to enforce the repeal of monetary law. In other words, besides a man that unjustly finds himself the victim of some authority that exploits his money, his time, his labor for which he earns that money. This taking up of arms seems as unwarrantable by the divine law, which we've discussed, and is repugnant to human feelings, as the opposite, which would be taking up arms to enforce the obedience thereto. So on both sides, he says, whether it be the English that takes up arms to enforce these pecuniary or monetary laws, or the colonists that take up arms to repeal those pecuniary or monetary laws, the object, he says, on either side does not justify the means. For the lives of men are too valuable to be cast away on such trifles such as pecuniary laws. It is the violence which is done and threatened to our persons, the destruction of our property by an armed force, the invasion of our country by fire and sword, which conscientiously qualifies the use of arms, and the instance in which such a mode of defense became necessary, all subjection to Britain ought to have ceased, and the independence of America should have been considered as dating its era from, and published by, the first musket that was fired against her. This line is a line of consistency, neither drawn by caprice, not extended by ambition, but produced by a chain of events of which the colonies were not the authors. So to recap, it's not within these pecuniary laws that justifies the present conflict. It is the violence which is done and threatened to our persons, the destruction of our property by an armed force, the invasion of our country by fire and sword, which conscientiously qualifies the use of arms. A much deeper meaning. And he says, in this instant, which requires the use of arms, the subjection to Britain ought to have ceased. And the very poetic statement that the independence of America should have been considered as dating its era from and published by the first musket that was fired against her. In other words, not from the Declaration of Independence, not from the signing or the ratification or the Congress to decide our Constitution, but rather that first shot that was fired against the colonies. In other words, in April of 1775, at Lexington and Concord, this was the date of American independence. I shall conclude these remarks by the following timely and well-intended hints. We ought to reflect that there are 3 different ways by which an independency may hereafter be effected, and the one of those 3 will, one day or other, be the fate of America, namely, by the legal voice of the people and Congress, by a military power, or by a mob. And by which one of these do we believe that we are most affected by in our modern day? My answer would be the mob. It may not always happen that our soldiers are citizens, and the multitude of body of reasonable men. Virtue, as I have already remarked, is not hereditary, neither is it perpetual. Should an independency be brought about by the first of those means, we have every opportunity and every encouragement before us to form the noblest, purest constitution on the face of the earth. we shall have it in our power to begin the world over again. A situation similar to the present has not happened since the days of Noah until now. The birth of a new world is at hand, and a race of men, perhaps as numerous as all of Europe contains, are to receive their portion of freedom from the events of a few months. The reflection is awful. In this point of view, how trifling, how ridiculous do the little paltry cavillings of a few weak or interested men appear when weighted against the business of a world. And so how wonderful is this paragraph, especially in light of that humanity that I attempted to insert in the middle of this episode of my own opinions. Much of it seems to be echoed here. He says, "It may not always happen that our soldiers are citizens, and the multitude a body of reasonable men." And certainly, I would say, Mr. Paine, that the multitude is no longer a body of reasonable men. Our soldiers are by and large citizens. Virtue, he says, is not hereditary. Neither is it perpetual. And this goes back to what I was saying about accepting the responsibilities of the divine authority, of not asking to be given something, but asking how it is that we may receive what we've already been given. Should an independency be brought about by the first of those means, by the legal voice of the people in Congress, we have every opportunity and every encouragement before us to form the noblest and purest Constitution on the face of the earth. We have it in our power to begin the world over again. A situation similar to the present has not happened since the days of Noah until now. And that's quite the statement. I'm not sure I would go quite that far. Perhaps Moses. But perhaps I misunderstand the gravity of the situation that they are dealing with there. But Noah was to save the world from destruction, save humanity from destruction. And if it is indeed the case that it was the view of these people, of these American colonists at this time in 1775, that they were facing a similar Sodom and Gomorrah type event, then my hat is off to them. For if they felt that, then they must have felt ready to accept the burdens that it comes with, even if the situation, the context that they found themselves in was not quite at the level of Noah. Because, as I might reason through here, in Noah's case, it was the destruction of the world, and it was his responsibility to retain the light of the divine spirit. It was his responsibility to retain the very categorization of human consciousness, to bring with him the names of the animals and hold it for future generations, and to teach them and to bring them up, not into ignorance, but up and out of ignorance. And in that sense, we can see some parallels to the American Revolution. But I reflect on the story of Moses, to be also a parallel in which you have a people that are freed from a tyrannical government. They go out into foreign lands, into the wilderness, as the American colonists have done. And Moses, he also retains the divine authority, the laws, and he produces a society that is representative. The tribes of Israel, they put together a head, and these heads carry the interest in mind of the people that they represent, a form of republican government, if you will. The birthday of a new world is at hand, and a race of men, perhaps as numerous as all Europe contains, are to receive their portion of freedom from the events of a few months. The reflection is awful. In this point of view, how trifling, how ridiculous do the little paltry cavillings of a few weak or interested men appear when weighed against the business of the world. So they really did feel at this time that their experience, their struggles, were not their own necessarily. It was for the entire world to see. And of course we know that the French took after this, and I've mentioned it in previous episodes that the French unfortunately were unable to handle the responsibilities of their freedom, of their liberties, the revolution taking place not too soon after the events of the American Revolution, and they fell into despotism, unfortunately. How interesting it is, the human experience, and the roads that we take. The collective consciousness is a wild animal at times, just as the individual can be a wild animal at times. But my question to myself and to the unknown lands of the internet is how? How do we influence this collective by not usurping divine authority and attempting it to bring it to into the hands of man? This is a difficult question. Should we neglect the present favorable and inviting period, the independence be hereafter effected by any other means, we must charge the consequence to ourselves, or to those rather, whose narrow and prejudiced souls are habitually opposing the measure, without either inquiring or reflecting. There are reasons to be given in support of independence, which men should rather privately think of than be publicly told of. We ought not to be deliberating whether we shall be independent or not, but anxious to accomplish it on a firm, secure, and honorable basis, and uneasy, rather, that it is not yet begun upon. So I'd like to pause here and to answer my previous question. It seems as though this type of dialogue, perhaps rhetoric, is a form of leadership. It is taking a stand. It is influencing my mind. And this influence, certainly on a large scale, allows one to appreciate liberty. And so it is within this leadership and this forthrightness, this firm idea, this faith that one has, to accomplish it on a firm, secure, and honorable basis, and uneasy, rather, that it is not yet begun upon. Every day convinces us of its necessity. Even the Tories, if such beings yet remain among us, should, of all men, be the most solicitous to promote it. For as the appointment of committees at first protected them from popular rage, so a wise and well-established form of government will be the only certain means of continuing it it securely to them. Wherefore, if they have not virtue enough to be Whigs, they ought to have prudence enough to wish for independence. In short, independence is the only bond that can tie and keep us together. We shall then see our object, and our ears shall be legally shut against the schemes of an intriguing as well as a cruel enemy. We shall then, too, be on a proper footing to treat with Britain, for there is reason to conclude that the pride of that court will be less hurt by treating with the American states for terms of peace than with those whom she denominates rebellious subjects for terms of accommodation. It is our delaying it that encourages her to hope for conquest, and our backwardness tends only to prolong the war. As we have, without good effect therefrom, withheld our trade to obtain a redress of our grievances, let us now try the alternative, by independently redressing them ourselves, and then offering to open the trade. The mercantile and reasonable part of England will still be with us, because peace with trade is preferable to war without it. And if this offer be not accepted, other courts may be applied to. On these grounds I rest the matter, and as no offer has yet been made to refute the doctrine contained in the former editions of this pamphlet, it is a negative proof that either the doctrine cannot be refuted, or that the party in favor of it are too numerous to be opposed. Wherefore, instead of gazing at each other with suspicious or doubtful curiosity, let each of us hold out to his neighbor the heavy hand of friendship, and unite in drawing a line which, like an act of oblivion, shall bury in forgetfulness every former dissension. Let the names of Whig and Tory be extinct, and let none other be heard among us than those of a good citizen, an open and resolute friend, and a virtuous supporter of the rights of mankind, and of the free and independent states of America. Beautiful. Beautiful. So we will leave this episode to conclude here today.